I'm in New York City, meeting left-wing activist and academic Norman Finkelstein, the son of Holocaust survivors, but also a harsh critic of Israel. For much of Finkelstein's career, he was a darling of the Palestinian cause. But when the movement's strategy changed and he disagreed, he went his own way.
And replace it with the opposite genital.
These days, Finkelstein's focus is identity politics.
Why would you celebrate that?
His latest book is a declaration of war on wokeness. You dispute that?
I think it's crazy.
I had a chance to sit down with him at his home to hear more about it and to learn what it's like to be so politically isolated. This is the InnerView. Professor Norman Finkelstein, there are a lot of bridges that I want to cross with you, a lot of places to go, but let's first talk about your latest book. I'll burn that bridge when I get to it. What's your problem with cancel culture and what is termed woke these days?
For the longest time, I didn't have a problem with it. I just ignored it. It seemed to be another college fad, of which I had experienced many in my day. I went through the period of political correctness, or what we call PC, and it seemed just another version of that, where people claim to be enlightened, the vanguard, and they're going to educate those who are suffering from all sorts of delusions and what we used to call back in the day false consciousness. So I didn't pay much attention to it. But then it became painfully obvious that it was politically a very pernicious phenomenon. And that was very blatant during the 2016 and 2020 Democratic primary runs of Bernie Sanders. The Bernie Sanders phenomenon was unique in my lifetime. It was the first class-based political insurgency in the United States since before World War II. And it demonstrated that we had reached a critical mass of Americans who were very dissatisfied with the way our system was unfolding. Indeed, they were so dissatisfied that mostly young people were willing to embrace a 78-year-old Jew from Brooklyn who called himself a democratic socialist. And this Bernie Sanders went on television night after night, because he was a prominent figure in the primaries, denouncing what he called Big Pharma as a bunch of crooks, calling Wall Street a gang of crooks, naming names like Goldman Sachs, and his message was really resonating. And then lo and behold, these woke folks who are supposedly leftists and progressives and the cutting edge of radical politics, one after another, be it a Ta-Nehisi Coates, who denounced Bernie Sanders for being weak on the black reparations question, or Gloria Steinem saying, oh, those girls, they just go to the Bernie rallies to meet the boys. And Gloria Steinem was the icon of feminism. But at that moment, it became obvious that this was not just another marginal college fad or fad in academia, but it was a really pernicious force in our society, political force. And that then caused me to read some of the iconic texts of woke politics. And I reached the conclusion that at bottom, woke politics is a right-wing phenomenon. It has nothing to do with left politics at all. It's a instrument of the Democratic Party. See, the big difference between political correctness and woke politics is political correctness was really marginal. A few campus radicals. But the Democratic Party has instrumentalized identity politics. It's using identity politics to displace what was once its base, namely the trade union movement. And now identity politics has real institutional force behind it, really formidable institutional force. Identity politics is the Democratic Party. Identity politics is the New York Times. Identity politics is the New Yorker magazine. Identity politics is Atlantic magazine. Identity politics has infiltrated most of what you would call liberal culture. And so its impact and the dangers it poses are much more significant than in my day with political correctness.
So identity politics as a lens through which to approach everything, whether on race, gender, but not class.
Right. Well, I think that what you just said is the crucial point. To displace class. It's identity politics was always part of the left in the sense that it was considered on the left a matter of it was just a natural thing. You were supposed to support the African American struggle in the United States. You were supposed to support the women's struggle in the United States. That was just part and parcel of being a leftist. Identity politics has appropriated those causes, the women's question, the Negro question, as it was called in my day, but have lopped off the class element.
Without the elites having to give up any of their privilege.
Yeah,
so you say the right thing and it sounds cool and
right.
People feel nice about themselves.
Yes.
But nothing changes. Right. But what makes you think this is a top-down thing and not something that's bubbled up from the bottom?
There was an element that was from the bottom. There's no question about that. I was a participant in a consistent way with the George Floyd demonstrations. They clearly resonated, or that the question of police brutality clearly resonated for large masses of young people. No question in my mind that it was real. It was from the bottom up. And it reflected genuine outrage and anger. But what eventually happened is our ruling elite, not different, I suppose, than most places in the world, except it's the scale. They have such vast sums of money, I mean breathtaking sums of money, that they're able to buy off everybody. It's a very, you have to have a very refined moral center to resist the temptations that come your way. Jeff Bezos, he gives not $1 million, not $5 million, not $10 million. He gives $100 million at a shot. He gave Obama $100 million. He gave this CNN black commentator, Van Jones, $100 million. Jack Dorsey, the former CEO of Twitter, he gave Ibram X. Kendi $10 million. And as I said, it's very hard to resist those sums.
Why are they giving that money?
Well,
what do you think is the driving force behind it?
It's perfectly obvious. It's called a life insurance policy. But that's true. If you're Jeff Bezos, you're a reasonably intelligent person, and you know at some point along the way, there's going to be a nationwide strike of Amazon. That's as inevitable as the sun rising in the morning and the sun setting in the evening. There will be a nationwide strike of Amazon workers. Now, here's a simple question. Where do you think Barack Obama is going to stand on that strike? At $100 million. Where do you think Van Jones is going to stand? I mean, these are life insurance policies. So my point is, the Black Lives Matter, it began as, like you said, it wasn't a conspiracy from above. It was a real outrage at the grassroots. But before you knew it, all the leaders, or the designated leaders by the ruling elite, they were buying homes on real estate, buying sprees. One of them is doing Cadillac commercials.
Right.
Then they start showing up at the Grammys, and they're showing up at the Oscars, and they're showing up at the Emmys. And you know.
So you feel like if you're that respected by the elite, maybe you've been co-opted. Do you think they know they've been co-opted or not?
I think that the human capacity for self-delusion is infinite, and you can convince yourself of anything. For me, as a person of the left always meant sacrifice for the cause. That you had to, as it were, pay your dues. So here is Rosa Luxemburg, and Rosa Luxemburg grew up in a middle-class family. Smartest student in her high school. She would have won the gold medal, except that they said she was politically too far to the left, or a troublemaker. Like Lenin was, by Russian standards, he was a nobleman. He too, gold medal in high school. He actually won it. He wasn't as politically active. So, Rosa, woman of really quite extraordinary mental capacity, one of the first women in the world to get a PhD in economics at the University, I think, of Geneva. And she spends most of her adult life in jail. Does she ever complain about it? It was not even within their thought process to complain.
So you believe there's no personal sacrifice with any of these sorts of leaders these days?
It's
not on evidence.
It's what the old expression, having your cake and eating it. You're not sacrificed. So already at that level, my instincts told me, this isn't a left, as the leftist tradition has identified it. Paul Robeson was the most famous man in the world after Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He linked his fortunes with the Soviet Union. He linked his fortunes with the left. His whole career was destroyed. I don't see careers being destroyed. I see careers being inflated.
Okay, so let me move this on a little bit
Right.
and then ask you, I don't see you on MSNBC or Fox or
I've never been
CNN,
on television.
especially not promoting this book. They probably wouldn't touch
I've never
you.
been on television.
You have had a lot of damage to your reputation, perhaps, your career.
I'm
You were
not sure
denied
about
tenure.
that,
Or
actually.
maybe not from your personal perspective, but
Mm,
in terms of smear campaigns
yeah.
in the aftermath of the Holocaust industry, taking on Dershowitz, your critical views of BDS later on. Tell me a little bit about the personal cost on
yeah,
you
look,
over that time.
I'm a person of the left. You know, I just said it a moment ago. You don't talk about personal costs. It comes with the turf. When Rosa Luxemburg, she once wrote, "When I die, I hope it'll be either in a street fight, at my post, or in prison." That was the ethic of the left. Of course, by those standards, I lived a charmed life. But you don't talk about your sacrifices. It's like talking about breathing. No, I'm serious. That is what it meant to be a person of the left. And it's a very striking thing to me when I read the letters, the correspondence, the personal correspondence of people on the left. Nobody ever talks about. There's no self-pity.
There's no self-pity, but does it hurt? So, for example, as a
It
son
frustrates.
of Holocaust survivors, both sides of your family, people annihilated in the Holocaust, right? You know, both sides of your parents' family. To be called an anti-Semite or to be called a self-hating Jew.
That to me is just stupid.
Hmm.
I can't say, there are things I would get indignant about. If you accuse me of misrepresenting a footnote, believe me, it's completely idiotic, but I am so fastidious about my getting the facts right. That upsets me, I'll admit it. But anti-Semite, well, I will have to, I have to be candid, because what's the point of an interview if I'm just putting a pretty face on things? Yeah, some things do, what you just said. I do remember as a young man when occasionally my mother and my father worried about, am I going too far, and it could come across as a self-hating Jew. And having come from that family, yes, that was a matter of concern to me, and I had to think twice about it. But apart from that, and that was a real issue for me, I don't want to diminish it. When I hear things like, okay, let me take one that I find, the one I don't have a problem with, the one that doesn't get under my skin, when I'm called a Holocaust denier, okay? So when I'm asked that question, I say, well, look, here's a simple thing. Everybody on my mother's side of the family was exterminated during World War II. Everyone on my father's side of the family was exterminated during World War II. Every day of my life, I was hearing stories about what happened during World War II. So, for me to be a Holocaust denier, given my family background, I have to be certifiably insane. There's no other, no, that's not a joke. There's no other way to interpret it. I have to be certifiably insane. And then you judge for yourself. Do I come across to you as being worthy of being institutionalized?
So far, no.
Well, that's certainly a relief that gives me immense consolation.
Because we don't have too much time left, do you feel a sense of personal regret that your relationship with many people who support the Palestinian cause seems to be somewhat soured since you criticized the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement for its tactics and as a vehicle for ending the occupation?
Absolutely not. Because, you know, I remember Mehdi Hassan, he once commented that I was a rock star, I had been a rock star in the Palestine solidarity movement, as in big fish in small sea. Let's not get carried away. That's my editorializing, not Mehdi. And I actually, yeah, it's a good feeling to be respected, so long as you feel like you earned the respect. And I never felt I earned the respect, but I felt I did my best. I was not Noam Chomsky. I was painfully aware of that because I would count him as one of my closest friends for 40 years. I knew where his intellect stood, and I knew where mine stood. So I can never say I earned the respect because I know what it means to be a titanic mind. However, I did my best. So the fact that people respected the fact that I did my best was a good feeling. However, it was never a popularity contest for me. I started out when you would talk to 5 or 6 people in a classroom when you were invited to speak. And if I really sought popularity, there was another route to it. I was reasonably intelligent, and as a young man, I was quite good looking, and that counts in the real world. So I could have found my way in a quote unquote respectable position. It was possible. And if I did not go that route, it was, in my opinion, fairly clear that popularity was not my priority, or even my second priority, or even my third priority. And to be perfectly honest, and I think I'm being honest, though as I said earlier, the human capacity for self-deception is infinite, at a certain point, I was not comfortable with being a quote-unquote rock star, because I subscribed to the belief. There was a very good French intellectual named Julien Benda, and he wrote a famous book called Treason of the Intellectuals. And he said, basically, I'm going to summarize a book in very simple terms. There are 2 sets of values. There's fame and fortune, or power and privilege, however you want to call it, and then there's truth and justice. And he said, those 2 sets of values are always and inherently in conflict. The more you pursue truth and justice, the less you're going to get fame and fortune. There is an inherent conflict between those values. So for me, when I started to get too popular, I began to wonder, am I doing something wrong? I mean that. Benda says, in one point, the clerk, by which he means like the intellectual, who's popular with the layman, which is like the masses, the clerk who is popular with the layman is a traitor to his office, which is to say, if you become too popular, then you're betraying the values of truth and justice. So I can say, and I think I'm being honest, that I wasn't altogether comfortable with this place I occupied. And when I became convinced that there was something seriously wrong with the BDS movement, I had no trouble, no compunction or conflict, except the political one, which is there is a cause, this is a major force in the cause, and you don't want to undermine the cause. That's a political consideration, a major political factor. However, once I became convinced that this was a hindrance, obstacle to the cause, I had no compunction about publicly saying, no, this is going in the wrong place, which is exactly what I did with the wokeness. I had to think twice, and I did think twice, and 3 times, and 4 times. Because you have to remember, I grew up in the 1960s, okay, and 70s. And I experienced a complete overturning of values. You know, in my day, up until 1986, homosexuality was considered a mental illness, and it was illegal to have sexual, what was called in the Supreme Court decisions, what's called same-sex sodomy. It was illegal. Women were homemakers. That's what a woman was. And there are 10,000 aspects of the society that I experienced, that I lived through, which were radically overturned in the course of my lifetime. I thought at the beginning of this whole wokeness phenomenon, maybe it was the same as in the 1960s. Conventional values are being overturned, and at some point they will just become the norm. So I really was unsure, but once it became plain to me that something was seriously awry here, I had no problem at all saying that this stuff is completely crazy.
I think that's a good point at which to wrap us up. Professor Norman Finkelstein, thank you so much for joining us.